This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
In southern Turkey is a site that some archaeologists have called the world's oldest temple. Is it really? What is the significance of Gobekli Tepe? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Joining me, two gentlemen who are authors, archaeologists, and explorers who've traveled from Peru to Turkey, involved in some of the most exciting excavations in the Holy Land, including scroll caves next to the Dead Sea at Qumran and the Gates of Hell at the foot of Mount Hermon. They are the co-authors of the new book, for which I was honored to write the foreword, and happy to do it. The new book, Decoding Gobekli Tepe, Biblical Anatolia, and the Watchers. And it's an honor to welcome back to the program Dr. Aaron Judkins and Dr. Judd Burton. Fellows, welcome.
Thanks for having us back.
Aaron, I'm going to start things. Well, I'm going to start off because we've talked about this program before, and now we've got the book out there for which we've been waiting for quite some time, and glad that it's out there. I should point out, number one new release at Amazon in 3 separate categories as of this recording, including controversial ancient knowledge, which is always fun when you can kind of stir the pot in that area. But I did get a question from a Bible-believing Christian, somebody who's deep into the Word of God, who asked, when I shared your first announcement about the book being out and hitting number one new release in archaeology, the archaeology category at Amazon, why should we be addressing this as Christians? Isn't the gospel enough? Aaron, why, I'll let both of you answer this, but Aaron, why would you say this even matters to Christians?
Well, it's a great question. To me, faith isn't really something that in Christianity, a lot of people think that Christianity is based off of a blind faith. But there's more to it than that. There's empirical evidence that points to our faith, the historicity of the Christian faith. So archaeology is just one of those that points to the evidence of the historicity of Scripture. And so if you can take that evidence and empirical evidence that's written in the stones, coming out of the dirt in archaeology, and it paints a picture to the past that confirms the biblical text, say in the Old Testament or even in the New Testament. But if you have that evidence, then I think it's noteworthy to put forth to people to say, hey, this is the evidence coming out of the ground, whether it's in Qumran at the Dead Sea Scrolls or whatever it is. But this is why archaeology is important, because there is sources, even outside the land of the Bible or the biblical text itself, that confirms the historicity of Scripture. So this is why it's important for me when I come along and find something that is, I think, fits into the biblical narrative in archaeology, then that's what I like to investigate. And I just simply say, hey, this is what we have found. And I want to show you this evidence. I want to show you this, not really a motive that would not be just convincing, but would increase and bolster one's faith. So it's not just a blind evidence, it's actually evidence coming out of the ground.
Judd, I know that you likewise have an interest in some of these prehistoric archaeological sites. Why do you think these things, sites like Gobekli Tepe, matter to Christians?
Well, there's so much going on in prehistoric and antique Anatolia that's really quite central to the biblical narrative. Although ancient Türkiye, Anatolia, is sometimes treated as a peripheral subject to biblical studies, but it's really central. With the Eden prospectively being there, with the Ark landing in the mountains of Ararat, so many of the cultures in ancient Anatolia that interacted with the peoples in the Levant, and of course it goes without saying that the entire the New Testament, much of it is happening in Asia Minor. And I don't know that a lot of Bible students think about it this way, but the entire nation of Israel was literally called out of ancient Anatolia because Abraham, this is not even factoring in the pre-flood and the early post-flood patriarchs, but Abraham, who is called out of Ur, and of course now we're relative. I know at least in these circles we're relatively certain that is not the Ur that we find in Lower Mesopotamia, but we're going to find that in places like either Shamlarfa or Kesh, that are in this area of southern Turkey, northern Syria, which was known in biblical times as Haran. So when archaeologists began looking at a cluster of sites that date back to prehistory from this region, I think that it's a very worthwhile and relevant thing for scholars who subscribe to a biblical worldview, or biblical scholars of all bent, really, to take a closer look at these sites and what relevance they might bear to the biblical narrative.
So, Aaron, there's a possible connection then between the geography of the early parts of the Old Testament with, as Judd said, Eden possibly being there, but certainly Noah's Ark landing there, Abraham being called from the region of Şanlıurfa or Haran, which is in southern Turkey, not southeast Iraq, and older sites like Gobekli Tepe and some of these other sites around it. There, as of last fall, there were like a dozen of these sites they called Tas Tepele, the stone hills, sites that go back 10,000 years and even earlier. So you're saying then that there's some connection there, spiritual connection between that part of Turkey and the Bible?
Well, indeed. I mean, we see, Judd just said that, this is where the region of Ararat is. It's some, 300 miles away. You have the Fertile Crescent, the plains of Haran. This is where I think civilization really sprung up in this area. And you have, the Old Testament Garden of Eden that's situated right in this area. So it's very interesting because there's you're right. There's a tie to the geography there because of these. I think the biblical text has given us back in Genesis, etc., that this is the area where all this happened. And so when you connect it to back to a spiritual tie, connection, this gets very interesting because now you get into the watchers and the spiritual connection that's happening because there is a lot of activity right here in this area.
I noticed that all of the chapter headings in the book, the 10 chapters, all begin with the word sacred. Judd, am I correct to assume that there is some sort of spiritual or sacred connection then at Gobekli Tepe?
Certainly, those chapters are aptly named, I think, largely because even if you're looking at the side of Göbekli Tepe and by extension some of these other newer finds, for the longest time, most scholars subscribe to the old Veer Gordon Child Neolithic Revolution thesis about how civilizations emerge, how city-state dwelling peoples emerge, that it took agriculture and pastoralism as the necessary precedents for cities to be built. That's absolutely not the case at Gobekli Tepe, and even the most staunch materialistic archaeologists who worked on these sites will contend that that's the case, that the thing that brought these people here was religion. That was the catalyst whereby all of these other things, like the stratification of society and centralization of polities and organized religion, those are all epiphenomenal of this cult that was established at Göbekli Tepe. And the structures that were erected, the artwork that we find there, is all reflective of that causality and those endeavors. And of course, all of these changes that result from it have tremendous implications for the cultural trajectory of humanity, because for most of humanity's duration on the planet, we've been horticulturalists or hunter-gatherers of one sort or another. And as I put it before, the 90-degree angle change in cultural trajectory that happens because of the events in this area of prehistoric Anatolia bring up some interesting questions. Because in later periods, this sort of significant change doesn't occur without a vastly superior technological, in many ways socially advanced outside culture coming in that often has drastic and irreversible and many times negative ramifications for the culture that's affected. The agency for that can't really be found in human populations in the Mesolithic going into the Neolithic. That agent of culture change, most archaeologists would have us believe simply occurred along the lines of linear cultural evolution, as a sort of philosophical byproduct of Darwinian evolution. But I mean, even hearing myself say that, it sounds absurd, because we also know that cultures don't behave like that over time and space. They ebb and they flow. So we're left with this question of agency. Who made the change? What made the change? And what Aaron and I have argued is that the agent for that change is not native to this planet, not native to this reality, in other words. So one can only go so far with materialism and naturalism. It takes a supernatural worldview to help to answer the question of this agency of change. And to the tenor of your question, it's of a spiritual nature, and one both Aaron and I would argue is relevant to not just students of the Bible, but Christians.
So, Aaron, just to make sure I understand correctly and that viewers, listeners are getting this as well, what we're seeing at Gobekli Tepe is a radical change. Judd described as a 90-degree turn in the culture there of a sort you would normally associate with, say, the Europeans landing at Plymouth Rock or at Jamestown or something like that, which, as Judd said, did not bode well for the native culture. You had a group that was far advanced from the Neolithic culture of Anatolia at the time, coming in and influencing them to put all of this time and effort, which you document in the book, the amount of effort and manpower that it took to build a site like Gobekli Tepe, multiplied by however many more there are, and they've only excavated small percentages of these sites. But it's not of this planet. I know that there are those who will go in a direction and have who will argue that these were the ancient astronauts who were then worshipped as gods in the ancient world. Who were these people or this group that influenced ancient man to build Gobekli Tepe?
That's a great question. That's the $1 million question, right? Who were these people? Some archaeologists would say that they were the Natufian culture, and others would say that they were a culture that came from the north and invaded this area. We don't exactly know who they were, but I tend to think that it's the Natufian culture but even some of the archaeologists that are working at the site say no, they were too far to the north. I think they weren't that far south. Of course, Gobekli Tepe is in the southwestern part.
Let me phrase my question better. Assuming it was the Natufian culture, who were these entities then who influenced the Natufians to build Gobekli Tepe and their sister sites? Its sister sites.
So this gets into an area where we have to look beyond the physical, because we do know that in this area, now that's weird to say as an archaeologist, because archaeology deals with material culture, things that we're digging out of the ground, things that we can physically see and put back together. But we do know that the people in the Neolithic were known as people of the bull. And we know specifically in this region, along the plains of Haran, they were worshiping the moon god. This is very evident throughout the region. There's plenty of archaeological evidence for this. So the spiritual connection behind the entity of the moon god is at play. And we don't know exactly who that is. I propose in the book it could be the deity Sin, because this is the most common deity, lunar deity in that region. We know that Abraham was called out of this area. His father Terah worshiped the moon god. This is right in the ancient city of biblical Edessa. This is Shanlurfa, modern day Shanlurfa now. God calls him out of that area after his father dies, when Abraham is, Abram's 75 years old, and then he calls him out of that area. We do see other sites that have the emblematic iconography of the crescent moon god, often displayed by the worship of two male entities, two human males, that are in reverence to the crescent moon standard. This iconography of the crescent moon is also found at Gobekli Tepe, not only on one of the stone pillars, Western Pillar or Eastern Pillar 18, but on Western Pillar 31 is an emblem of a bull cranium image on the neck area. So these two images, I think, represent the iconography of these two particular deities. The crescent moon or the full moon above it on Eastern Pillar 18, representing the power over the heavens and the imagery of the moon god, and the deification of the ancient auroch bull, which represents the powers over the earth.
That is fascinating to me, because I know that well into even into the classical era, the last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, was a worshiper of Sin, the moon god. And there are some scholars who think that the priesthood of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, the king of the Babylonian pantheon, may have opened the gates to Cyrus and the Medo-Persians, because they were not happy that Nabonidus was trying to replace the Marduk at the top of the pantheon with the moon god. But Nabonidus' mother was a priestess of Sin at the city of Haran. So we're talking about a worship in that area dedicated to the moon god that lasted 9,000 years at least, based on the evidence at Gobekli Tepe. Judd, what are the deal with what's the deal with those T-shaped pillars, which are found not just at Gobekli Tepe but at other sites in the vicinity? I mean, why was this a recurring theme?
Well, the T-shaped pillars probably represent some sort of anthropomorphism. They were probably dual function. One of the theories is that the animal skins were used to make the coverings for the tops of the temples. they've since come along and said that that's one of a number of options, but they do appear to be dual function, in my estimation, because of the anthropomorphism of not just the T-shaped pillars, but the standing structures in Göbekli Tepe and sites like that. They represent this transition from animism and totemism, which you see remnants of at Göbekli Tepe because of the preponderance of animals that are carved. But they represent this transitional phase in the way that the people there viewed their gods, in much the same way that the Olmec in Mesoamerica had these what seem to be gods in transition. They're gods that still have some animal parts, and in the same way that the Egyptian gods retain some of that sort of thing. The were-jaguar, for instance, is one of the most prominent of the Olmec deities. It sort of represents this, and so when you begin to walk this through the biblical lens, though, and particularly when you consider the question of cultural agency, cultural change agency that I mentioned a moment ago, and your alternatives dwindle quickly in the material world, that then begs the question: is what were they? Where do these anthropomorphic models come from? Because it doesn't seem to be a self sort of worship; it's an externalized sort of worship. And really, the only thing that you're left with is in the biblical perspective, is that there were angelic entities. We know that, from not just from Genesis, but from associated apocryphal commentary on Genesis, that all of this is happening in prehistory. Whatever chronology people want to ascribe to that, that's up to them. But we're talking about both pre-flood and early post-flood prehistory here, essentially. And what Aaron and I are saying is that Göbekli Tepe and associated sites were watcher outposts, because they knew that there was something significant about this territory, and so wrangling in the ideological and spiritual control over these regions, over their people, would seem to be a logical stratagem for them if they wanted to corrupt humanity. And we think that part of that influence can be felt at Göbekli Tepe. And so, to your question, I think the standing structures at Göbekli Tepe, to some degree or another, represent this change, not only in the abstract, in the religious ideology, but these are things that these people were seeing with their own eyes.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that would reflect the theriomorphic, the part human, part animal description of some of the entities that fly out of the abyss, for example, in Revelation chapter 9, which is not at all how the Greeks and the Romans depicted the Titans who had been confined in the netherworld. But, the Greeks and the Romans were living thousands upon thousands of years after those entities had been confined to the abyss. So, Aaron, are you suggesting then that perhaps the theriomorphic depictions, the hybrid, chimeric sorts of entities depicted in the iconography at Gobekli Tepe may reflect what the watchers actually look like?
Well, there's certainly anthropomorphic. I mean, we're seeing the same architectural T-pillars throughout the region, not only Gobekli Tepe, but Hamzon Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Navali Chori, Sefer Tepe, and some other sites. They're T-pillars. Matter of fact, Navali Chori, I think, is where they very first found the T-pillars prior to Gobekli Tepe's discovery. So it's not an isolated phenomenon, but the common architecture throughout the region, again, just the common theme and the design is not isolated at Gobekli Tepe. Again, Novali Chori, Karahan Tepe have very similar architectural features, and this anthropomorphic T-pillar stones. Now, that's not to say that it's at every one of them, but what's interesting is that this ties a commonality into each one of these sites throughout the region. And what I like to do is, I try to take a step back, what I call the 35,000 foot aerial recon version. Now, 35,000 feet, you're not going to be able to see a lot of detail, more probably like around 10,000 feet. But the point is to get a wider view of what's happening in the region. This is what I did with solving the Los Lunas Mystery Stone in New Mexico. I just broadened out and I looked at the region in context and tried to answer some questions. And so this is how I think I solved the Los Lunas Mystery Stone out in New Mexico, which is the ancient Paleo-Hebrew in the New Mexico desert. So I took the same approach with Gobekli Tepe. So I just kind of widened out and just to see what's happening in the region. And this commonality is throughout the region. So what it tells us is that there is a similar ideology for the reason why they're doing that. And Judd said it, it's not because of agriculture, it's a religious ideology that brought them together first in a religious context. So what's that context? It's a Mesopotamian cosmology that we know, one, that they were worshiping the moon god, two, they were venerating ancestors as far back as 2000 BC, which, Derek, you succinctly note in your book, Veneration, that we have an archaeological marker for veneration of the dead. This, of course, this happens now with cultures like in Japan and in South and Central America. They still venerate their ancestors. But the anthropomorphic images that we see are very common. And I think particularly in Enclosure D at Gobekli Tepe, the two central pillars that are 18.5 foot tall, these anthropomorphic, which means that they're human-like images, no face, but they do have arms, they have a belt, they're wearing a fox pelt loincloth, certainly is very intriguing. And I think probably perhaps we've identified at least these two in Enclosure D in the book, and I get into the reasons why. But these are, I think, very definitive causes for deification of ancestors and for veneration.
Judd, I know this is something you've studied quite a bit. I've cited you. We cited you in the book Veneration, also in some of our other works, Second Coming of Saturn, because of the paper that you wrote. In fact, Second Coming of Saturn was the one that was coming out just after you wrote your paper on the origin of the term that I see shows up in your book, Decoding Gobekli Tepe, a number of times, and that is Rephaim. And you trace it back to that same general geographic area that we're talking about here, biblical Anatolia. What connections can we draw? Can we interpret anything about the use of Gobekli Tepe based on this idea of venerating ancestors or venerating especially the deified kings of old, the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the general structure of that idea begins in that region. The paper that you're referencing, the War of the Words, was basically a summative linguistic analysis of the word Rephaim and words that were used for king or ruler or chief in Eurasian languages. And many of them I found shared the initial consonant vowel morpheme with Rephaim. So in just the most immediate sense, Rephaim, which is a Hebrew word, is related to words like Rabbah in Sumerian and Akkadian, which means prince or king. But a basic survey of words for king in both directions, spreading out from the Transcaucasus and Eastern Turkey, were where many linguists place something called the Proto-Indo-European language shift somewhere between 6 and 4000 BC, basically birthing the major language families that are spoken in Europe and Asia. You know, words like regal and rey in Spanish, and royal in English, and Cree and the Gaelic languages, and Rolls in Slavic languages, and Rajan in Sanskrit, and some of the related dialects in Southeast Asia. It occurred to me that because language is the ocean on which culture floats, that this probably speaks to an older bit of cultural engineering on the part of the responsible cultural change agents that we're talking about here tonight. That they imposed this structure of rulership and subjugation on humanity. The Watchers did. They took God's perfect order, his just kingship, and turned it into despotism and tyranny and absolutism. Because if you look at the history of monarchy in the world, most of it falls into that category. And that seemed to me to be little chance that was an accident, that it speaks to the kind of either the actual cultural engineering of those ideas, or the manipulation and adaptation to variations of it over space and time. So I can't help but think, particularly because religion is used as a means of subjugation, if indeed we're looking at the Watchers as the agents of change here, that this system, which becomes part and parcel of civilizations, of city-states and empires, this system of rulership is tied directly to not just the linguistic phenomena among humans that historical linguists can chart back to this place, to this region, but it speaks also to the residues of the Watchers and their progeny, the Nephilim and the Rephaim, that continued these ideas and institutions and practices. Speaking
of language, Aaron, I want to get to something that I just thought was fascinating when Sharon and I were reading an early draft of this. And I think we went through it, both of us, during the course of one long flight. We have found that the people called the Luwians of southern Anatolia in ancient times are really fascinating. Their beliefs, as recorded in the Luwian language, have elements of Mesopotamian culture in them, but also you can see how they may have influenced what became the Greek and Roman religions, perhaps as the culture through which Mesopotamian ideas, Hurrian ideas, who were the people who originated in the plains of Ararat and brought the idea that we need to contact the spirits in the netherworld to what became the land of Israel, Canaan. The Luwians appear to be the key to understanding or to decoding Gobekli Tepe. What did you find on these pillars? You mentioned Western Pillar 31 in Enclosure D, Eastern Pillar 18. What iconography there did you see that triggered your interest, and how do you connect it to a literate culture thousands of years later?
Well, the idea is that, I believe this is simply not artistic motifs on the stones at Gobekli Tepe. And when I noticed on both of those anthropomorphic figures, the two central pillars in Enclosure D that are 18.5 feet tall, well, about where the neck would be, there's imagery. We talked about the crescent moon. There's a circle above that, which I think could be a full moon disk. And then right above that is what we would think of as the letter H in English. And then on the other one, Western Pillar 31, you had the imagery of the bull cranium, which is the image of a bull skull with the horns. And to me, that stood out because in one of the other pillars was a logogram that I had recognized as a logogram for Deus, or for God. And I've seen this particular logogram before, and I wasn't quite sure what it was doing on one of these pillars in Gobekli Tepe. And so that got me really searching about what the logogram, the Luwian logogram for Deus, was on the stone. And I think it was, it's on one of the other pillars in another enclosure, but it clearly is the identification for Deus. So when I got to looking at that, that really prompted me to get into what the Luwian logograms were, because I hadn't really studied it at all. I was familiar with the one logogram, Deus, but I didn't really know about any of the other until I started really digging into this. And then when I realized that the Luwians were contemporary, they lived contemporaneously with the Hittites, and so the Hittites adopted. They had two languages basically. They had a Sumerian language, but they also adopted the Luwian language, and the archaeologists discovered Luwian back in the 1800s, but they misclassified it as hieroglyphic Hittite. And it wasn't until about the 1940s that they realized that they had misidentified it. It's actually Luwian logograms, which more specifically is Anatolian hieroglyphics. Anatolian hieroglyphics are known in this area. I think in 1943 they found Luwian logograms, which are Anatolian hieroglyphics, at Kara Tepe. Now, that's not to be confused with Karahan Tepe. It is Kara Tepe, but they found Luwian logograms at Kara Tepe, I think, in 1943. So this is well documented in the literature. A lot of the logograms have been identified, but there's hundreds that have not been identified. So when I started digging into the literature for Luwian logograms, there's two parts to that. There's silograms, which is based on sound. There's logograms, which is a symbol represents a word. So so the Hittites and the Luwians did this specifically when they're recording on monumental stone structure. You don't have a lot of room to write. You got limited space, and you need to make it count when you write, because you're literally putting it in stone. So so Sumerian's not the language for that, but logograms are, because one logogram symbol can represent a word or an idea. So this is exactly what we see written on the stones at Gobekli Tepe, this Luwian logogram, Anatolian hieroglyphic on these stones. And if that's the case, now, as far as I know, this is a new theory that's been that we're coming out with some new theories in the book. One is called the Regeneration theory. Two is that there's language on these stones called Luwian logograms. If these are Luwian, then Luwian is not supposed to go that far back in time, some 9,600 years ago. Luwians, like I said earlier, were contemporaneous with the Hittites. So if this is indeed Luwian, it's not simple art motifs, it's language. And the language is telling us something on these stones, and this is what I get into in the book, Decoding Gobekli Tepe.
So yeah, there's about a 7,000-year gap between the time of Gobekli Tepe and the arrival, according to archaeologists, of the first Luwian-speaking people in Anatolia around 2200 BC. Yeah. Most of their writings that have been recovered date to the, as you say, the contemporaries with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, down to the time of the Exodus. Began to fade from use after the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BC. But the bottom line is that's about a 1,000-year period where Luwian was used quite frequently. In fact, it was the dominant language in the Hittite Empire after about the time of the Exodus around 1400 BC. But again, how do you account for that 7,000-year difference?
There's a chronology problem here if it's Luwian, and
Yeah.
it's just a theory. Really it's a hypothesis, and so it's circumstantial. But look, only 5% of Gobekli Tepe has been excavated. Only 5%, and the 5% has really stayed 5% over the last, I think, 5 to 7 years. The rate really hasn't changed. As a matter of fact, they're slowing down excavations at Gobekli Tepe, and there's some other things going on there with that. But at the current rate of excavations, without slowing down, at the normal pace that they have done, it would take about 150 years to excavate this 20-acre site. So it's very slow. It took about 10 years to excavate enclosure D alone. So it's very meticulous. It's very difficult because it's not just throwing a bunch of dirt out. I think the German Institute of Archaeology is doing a wonderful job there. It takes a lot of time and effort, as Judd could testify. It's not easy work, and you have to catalog it. And so it's important to do it right. I think they are doing it right. But the point is that more excavations really needs to be done. And I would like to see experts in Luwian, which are not that many experts in Luwian, but I would like to see some experts in Luwian, or even the archaeologists at the German Institute of Archaeology who's digging at the site, to examine this and see if it is Luwian, because if it is, it really changes the nature of what we know at Gobekli Tepe. So you either have to push that Luwian all the way back, which I don't think you can do, or you have to culturally redate Gobekli Tepe, not to the pre-pottery Neolithic Stone Age, but that would actually date it culturally to the Bronze Age, which is a vast difference.
It's a huge difference, right? The first Proto-Indo-Europeans from which Luwian descends probably didn't arrive until the Bronze Age in Anatolia. At least that's the current theory. Judd,
but those are the two potentialities that you're left with. We either have to date it younger, or that makes Luwian a rediscovered language.
Okay, or one that was just prominent in that area because there was something special about it.
But in Luwian, actually, it was birthed in this area of southwestern Anatolia. This is where the Luwians live. This is right in this area where we find Gobekli Tepe. So it's within the exact region of where we would expect to find Luwian. But according to conventional dating, the Luwians aren't supposed to be at the site. And what makes it interesting is that if this is Stone Age, pre-pottery Neolithic, then you have something that you shouldn't have in a Stone Age society: megalithic architecture, a division of labor, organization, and the ability to do such a monumental feat before the invention of writing, or before the invention of the wheel, or before the invention of pottery. So we have something major going on at Gobekli Tepe. What I like to point out, what Dr. Burton had said about it early on, is the paradigm that's changing the paradigm, because it is. Gobekli Tepe archaeologically turns everything upside down, and it's not agriculture first. It's religious ideology that comes into play first. Then people come together because of this ideology and this cosmology we're talking about in the book. And then you have people that come together, and now they understand that people are actually living at the site of Gobekli Tepe. They found 3 human burials at Gobekli Tepe. So what we know about Gobekli Tepe is changing. We're putting forth some new theories about this.
It just occurs to me that the existence, that 7,000 year gap between Gobekli Tepe and the emergence of written Luwian records may be explained if Luwian was a liturgical language. It was preserved because there was something sacred about it. Yeah. Like Sumerian was preserved long after the fall of the last Sumerian kingdom because it was a religious language.
Well, they did use Luwian as a written, religious, formal language. It was a formal sense of writing. They probably spoke it, but it was used formally on these stones to write. And I think they did it to record religious or ritual events that they wanted to record in stone. So it was a special way of recording on monumental structures on stone this is exactly what the purpose of Luwian was. And we actually see the Hittites adopting this into their culture and adopting the Luwian language and these logograms. But look, it's very clear the logogram for Deus is God. Transliterated from there to the Latin is the term Deus, which our English means God. And then when you look at that H symbol in logogram, that H symbol that you see along the belt there, the anthropomorphic images, is the logogram for either gate or for portal. So when you tie all this together, if the symbology is correct in logograms, its language and the idea is conferring potentially this could be the gate or the house of the gods, specifically the moon god that has that crescent standard on the anthropomorphic image. So this is very interesting because I think they've deified at least two of these things we talked about earlier, the deification of the moon and the deification of the bull, but they've also identified two others in their ancestry that they consider father ancestors, and that is the deification of Adam and Eve.
Oh, okay. Judd, I want to throw this to you, and I know that we're still just scratching the surface of this, but to keep this at a manageable length, you mentioned one of the new theories, the Luwian connection. What is the regeneration hypothesis that's being put forward for Gobekli Tepe in your book?
Well, I will probably pitch this back to Aaron because he's done the groundwork on a lot of this. But again, it's all tied into a kind of artificial immortality. I think that the other side likes to sell the rest of human and has for all of human history. With these older ideas of animism and totemism having previously been at Göbekli Tepe, or not just Göbekli Tepe, but the entire Anatolian plateau, those ideas were sort of nascent. But it's not until you see the overlay of a more organized system of religion that it becomes a more cogent religious philosophy.
Well, it's interesting because when you start looking at the iconography here, there's a symbolism that goes back to the idea of worship and revering or venerating the ancestors. And I think this is why you have the anthropomorphic images. Not only that, but you also have anthropomorphic images that are headless, but they have ichthyophallic imagery. And if you're dead, why do you need to portray that? This is, so, and this is just then.
For people who are not familiar with that term, it refers to a male who is sexually aroused.
Phallic image. And you see a lot of this phallic imagery at Gobekli Tepe, but not only there, at Karahan Tepe and other sites, you see a lot of phallic imagery. I think this goes back to the idea of this lost Axis Mundi, which is this lost connection that they had between the heavens and the earth, between God and people back in the Garden of Eden. We talked about that earlier. But look, when sin happened, entropy gets introduced, sin comes into the earth. It's in Adam and Eve. Now they're clothing themselves. Why? Because they're naked. When God's strolling through the garden and he goes, "Where are you?" He's not wondering where they're at. It's a rhetorical question. What have you done?
Yeah.
It's like when you come to your kids, it's like, hey, where are you at? What have you? He's making them answer, what have you done? Well, why? And they answer, well, we're hiding. Why are you hiding? Well, because we've done this. And so we see that these anthropomorphic images have belts holding up fox pelt loincloths in front of them. And so why would you need an anthropomorphic image covering your nakedness if there is not anything to that except for the idea of going back to the Old Testament Garden of Eden, where sin comes into play into Adam and Eve? and this is the very idea of this regeneration that we see. That's basically have identified a lot of these burial sites that is associated with the deification of Eve, because Eve, the female, in these ancient cultures, was seen as the mystery of creation. Why? Because they had the ability to procreate. Both of them are considered father ancestors, but the female had the ability to give childbirth. And so we see that even in death, when they suffered a physical death, that in their cosmology, they're being regenerated back through the natural birth cycle of life and death. So when the female gives birth, it's the regeneration of the son. In particular, it's the regeneration of the son, who is then reborn from that ancestor to carry on the line. And then when they die, their parts of their skull fragments, which we see at Gobekli Tepe, are then venerated. So in a secondary type of, after they're buried in a Chattahoochee, they're buried under the floor of the home. But then we see these skulls are being repatriated back, just the skulls, at the Gobekli Tepe. Why? Is because it's a cycle of regeneration. So when someone dies, is to get them to go back through the regeneration cycle, so that from the netherworld, they get reborn into the afterlife as a star god back to the heavens. And this is exactly what they've deified Adam in the sky imagery of the deity An, which is, we see that this imagery An is a Mesopotamian deity, which is the highest of the deities in the pantheon. And we see this imagery is associated with the bull. And so when you have A for father, ancestor, and then you have N, and the Sumerian word An, the N is to lift up or to the high or the highest. When you put these together with the father imagery, it becomes the deification of the sky bull An, which I think they've deified Adam as, and then later they've deified also the imagery of Eve. And then we see this throughout later cultures in the imagery of Ishtar and Ashtar worship, the lady. And we get into all this in the book, but it's very interesting because now this regeneration theory is to reattain eternal life that they lost back in the garden.
Judd, again, just to kind of wrap things here, final question, and I'll have you answer this as well, Aaron. Judd, what do you hope people take away from reading Decoding Gobekli Tepe?
Well, I hope that people, well, number one, I hope that it gets people interested in turning to the Bible to walk through, particularly the discoveries in prehistoric and ancient Anatolia that are taking place almost on a weekly basis. I mean, it's a onion that's being peeled back almost weekly. But in particular, since we're focusing on Gobekli Tepe in this month, in this book, I would hope that people would, because it's part of biblical prehistory, because it's in a biblically significant land, that people would consider what role, it had not only in the biblical narrative in general, but more specific things like what were the Watchers doing here? Why would they weaponize a place like this? Why would they pick Anatolia as a place to do it, as opposed to the later homeland of the nation of Israel? So we're hoping to look. We're asking questions too, but we're hoping that we'll prompt some questions from people as they read this, and overall hope that they're edified by it.
Aaron, what do you hope people will take away from the reading of Decoding Gobekli Tepe?
Going back to your very first question at the top of all this, Derek, was why is it important? Why does it matter to the everyday normal Christian? It matters, and I'll preface this with the second answer on this, but it matters because if we can understand the point of origin back in the Old Testament times, back when people were first worshiping these deities through the influence of the Watchers, which we know that's very clear throughout the Scripture, that there's principalities and powers that have influenced. As a matter of fact, we see in the Table of Nations and these 70 nations that were relegated over to the enemy, and God saves himself one, and that is Israel, but he relegates the other 70 to the enemy. And I think this is the very beginning stages of all this. When you run back Ishtar and Ashtar worship, Baal worship, when you see one, you see the other one. They're always tied together. They're always tied together. And I think this is the very beginnings of Baal worship that we're seeing in this part of the world. It all ties because the influence of the Watchers was so prevalent in this area. And this is before the birth of the nation of Israel, before the people become a nation. But look, the powers and the principalities that are influencing the nations that's going to be around them are already being birthed way before. The enemy already knows that he can't stop this, but he can probably slow it down. And so we see that in the very beginnings of the pantheon of deities that are being worshipped at Mesopotamia, this is the influence that's happening to influence actually spiritually the nation of Israel. And so if you can stop that attack, if you can stop that nation from being formed with the entities that are being influenced in this region, then you don't have the nation of Israel. It doesn't exist. And this is why you see the Anakim in the land and the giants also after that in Numbers 13:33, where the children of Israel go in and they see the sons of Anak in the land after the flood. And they're all in there. And then you get the Rephaim and the Nephilim, and you see that Moses and Abraham, King David nearly got killed fighting some of these guys. Matter of fact, his men pulled him back from one of the last battles, said, hey, you nearly got wiped out in that last battle. We're holding you back. So we see that this influence in the region, it all starts right here in the very beginnings of the Fertile Crescent in this area of Gobekli Tepe.
Absolutely. This is fascinating stuff. The book is Decoding Gobekli Tepe, Biblical Anatolia and the Watchers. The authors, Dr. Aaron Judkins, Dr. Judd Burton. You'll find them online, aaronjudkins.com and burtonbeyond.net. Gentlemen, thank you for your research. Thank you for your time. And again, thank you for the invitation to write the foreword to the book. I really, my honor to do it. Enjoyed talking with you,
Derek,
fellas.
for writing that. We really appreciate it. And thanks for having us on.
Again, the book Decoding Gobekli Tepe, Aaron Judkins, Judd Burton, the authors. Aaron Judkins online, aaronjudkins.com. Judd Burton online, burtonbeyond.net. And we got something to tell you about coming up that I just think is fascinating. The Wheel of the Giants in Israel is actually rotating. Yes, it's science. We'll talk about that and some conferences that we can not tell you about, but we can at least tell you roughly when they're going to be, including 1, 2 coming to the Ozarks in the near future. So you start making plans. That and more as A View from the Bunker continues straight ahead. Jesus declared that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. But humans have tried to contact fallen angels on the other side of those gates since the Stone Age, and they're still trying today. Arm yourself with information. During January, our special offer features our new books, The Gates of Hell and Destination Earth, co-authored with Donna Howell and Allie Anderson. Find out where Jesus was baptized, why it wasn't where most people think, and why it was a declaration of war against the fallen realm. How the belief in ancient aliens is based on the New Age and occult teachings of Madame Blavatsky and Aleister Crowley, and how Hollywood has effectively spread the ET gospel. Our 2 new books, plus the DVDs What Lies Beneath, about the world's oldest temple, Gobekli Tepe, and the 13-part teaching DVD based on the second coming of Saturn. This is a $99 value, but during January, it's just $45 plus shipping and handling. Only at gilberthouse.org/store. driving the internet to think every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. You'll also find us on social media at X, formerly Twitter, at View from Bunker, at Derek Gilbert, at @GilbertHouse_TV. Facebook, our page there is View from the Bunker. Truth Social, Gab, at Derek P. Gilbert. Online, VFTB.net, GilbertHouse.org, DerekPGilbert.com, and on YouTube, of course, the channel there at Gilbert House. Please subscribe, share, click the bell for notifications, hit the like button, and then subscribe to our mobile app to guarantee we never get canceled. That gets you all of our content, all of our video, audio content. We produce about 4.5 hours a week of video and audio. And occasionally on this program, when we start talking geopolitics and theopolitics, might trigger an algorithm. So just protect yourself. Guarantee that we never get canceled. We've got apps for iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle Fire phones and tablets. Also for your TV. If you've got a smart TV preloaded with Roku or Amazon Fire TV, or if you've got a set-top box, Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire Stick, please add the Gilbert House app to your television and all of our video content, audio content too. It all gets brought into that device, bypassing the gatekeepers of big tech. The one advantage, actually several advantages to the mobile app, is that there is a Bible module on there. We've also got a calendar of our upcoming events, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. And the community, the messaging section, which has become sort of like a self-contained offline social media site where you can exchange notes, ask questions of Sharon and me, ask for prayer, give prayer. All of that in the palm of your hand. Again, iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle Fire. And we have links to all of those app stores at VFTB.net. Look for the link in the top menu bar, or at GilbertHouse.org/app. Normally at this point, I try to do something that hopefully encouraged you to stay viewing through the, or listening through the promo for our special of the month. And oftentimes it's a story of somebody doing something goofy or silly or politically unwise. But this week, I want to share this story, this paper that Sharon posted a link to several days ago. And then I was reminded of it by our friend John Fryer, who sent me this through Messenger. So John, thank you for kind of nudging my memory, because I read this paper last night as I'm recording this, and was just, it's the implications of this are very interesting. Now, from a scientific standpoint, it's probably got a boring explanation, but from a spiritual, theological standpoint, I just find it really, really interesting. Sharon and I have been blessed to go to Gilgal Rephaim on the Golan Heights 3 times now since 2019. We spent a day there last spring. Well, actually, this was 2 years ago, to 2023, with the archaeologist who's done the most recent excavations there, Dr. Mike Freakman, going back 12, 15 years when he started working there. He's fascinated with this megalithic structure, which is huge. Gilgal Rephaim is immense. It's estimated between 42,000 and 60,000 tons of stone. Now compare that to Stonehenge, which is much more famous. Stonehenge, they estimate about 2,500 tons of stone. 2,500, 60,000. Big difference. And the age of this, according to Dr. Freakman, he used a technique called optically stimulated luminescence of undisturbed soil from inside the central core at Gilgal Rephaim. He estimated the age of this at between 3,700, he put it at 3710 BC, give or take 150 years. That's the reading they got. So anywhere from, say, 3560 to 38, I think it was plus or minus 170 years actually, 3880 BC, somewhere in there. So 3700 BC to round it off as a rough figure for when this was constructed. But he also, during his excavations, found a much older wall in the vicinity that was apparently dismantled and the stones reused to build Gilgal Rephaim. So a paper was published in November that found, using what they call remote sensing, and I'm not sure if it's entirely, because I was reading this late at night last night as I was falling asleep. Part of it satellite imagery, part of it geomagnetic measurements, but they have determined that with these measurements, Gilgal Rephaim and the surrounding area, so this is not just the wheel itself. Gilgal Rephaim literally means wheel of the giants or wheel of the Rephaim. Locally, it's called Rujum El Hiri, which means heap of the wildcats. We heard jackals when we were there in the distance, not wildcats, but anyway. This area around the Sea of Galilee and presumably the entire Eastern Mediterranean, so this would include all of Israel, but they could only speak to Gilgal Rephaim itself. What they were trying to do was determine whether it was astronomically aligned when it was built almost 6,000 years ago. There are two gates, one to the northeast, one to the southeast, and Dr. Freakman's analysis is that they were centered, when you look from the central core outward through those gates, on extinct volcanoes on the horizon, Tel Saki and Tel Ferez, both of which are currently being used by the IDF to look into Syria because they're very close to the border. Gilgal Rephaim is less than 5 miles from the border with Syria. So they wanted, the researchers using this remote sensing, wanting to look at whether this had moved in any way over the years. I mean, has it always been oriented in the same direction? In other words, has it moved over the centuries, which is a reasonable assumption because it's in a very seismically active area. The Dead Sea Transform is a fault line that runs right up from the Red Sea through the Arava, the Dead Sea, the Jordan Valley, the Sea of Galilee, the Bekaa Valley. All of that is formed by this fault line between two tectonic plates. Well, apparently this has led to that region, Israel, the Sea of Galilee, and Gilgal Rephaim, which is about 10 miles east-northeast of the Sea of Galilee, rotating counterclockwise at the rate of between 8 and 15 millimeters per year. That's on a geological scale, that's pretty fast. Rotating counterclockwise. So the wheel is literally rotating, as is all of the land around it. Now, because these measurements that were used are relatively recent, they can't really extrapolate back 6,000 years, but they did. And in the paper, they suggest that because of the rate of rotation, that it's possible that Gilgal Rephaim has rotated tens of meters. Now, I did some rough calculations, assuming 10 millimeters per year over a period of 6,000 years, and you wind up with a little less than about 2,000 feet of rotation. That's like 2/5 of a mile, 4/10 of a mile. That's pretty fast. I mean, that's pretty far. So their point is, it could not have been used for astronomical observations or to mark the seasons because the direction it's oriented today is not where it was in the past. Now, here's the thing. Now, if you start seeing the camera shifting, it's because the dogs have entered the room, and apparently it's time for wrestling. They don't know for a fact that this movement has been consistent or has even taken place over the last 6,000 years of the history of Gilgal Rephaim. I would argue that it probably isn't a very old phenomenon because when we visit there, and Dr. Freakman has confirmed this in the papers that he's written about the site, that on the summer solstice, the rising sun shines through an opening in a roof box, he called it, just over the entry. Just over the entry that leads into the central core of Gilgal Rephaim. So if this had rotated counterclockwise from 2,000 feet to the southeast to where it is today, it would be awfully coincidental if it's just aligned with the summer solstice today in the 21st century because it had rotated this way over the last 6 millennia. So I don't think this is a very recent, I think this is just a recent phenomenon, which also is just begs some very interesting questions. What caused the movement to start? Why is the whole area suddenly spinning counterclockwise? Is there something underneath the land of Israel, and specifically the ancient land of Bashan, which was believed in the ancient world to be the entrance to the netherworld that's trying to get out? I'm only halfway joking when I ask that question. We will be talking about this. This will be in your past already, because I'm sure we'll bring this up on this weekend's PID radio. So to the archaeologists who found this, thank you, because I'm sure this is an interesting bit of science that's going to work its way into the novels that Sharon and I are currently working on. I've already shared this with a couple of friends of ours who are in the final editing process of a book about Gilgal Rephaim and the nearby Serpent Mound of Bashan, and they are arguing in favor of astronomical alignments. So, like, hey guys, what do you think about this? And they read it. It's like, we're not changing the book. But again, the fact that the sun shines through that opening over the entrance to the central core on the summer solstice suggests that this movement, 8 to 15 millimeters per year counterclockwise around Gilgal Rephaim, is relatively recent. But again, what's going on inside the earth? Well, a few things to tell you about. We've got the conference coming up, the Men's Discipleship Weekend, that is, the 24/7 Men's Discipleship Weekend, February 20th through 23rd. I will be one of the speakers, but basically every time there's a session that involves speaking and teaching, that's me. I've got 8 presentations over the course of the weekend. There will be other events there. Again, this is a men-centered weekend. The theme of it is Giants, Gods, and Dragons, recovering the worldview of the apostles and prophets. And if you want to find out more, if you're in Manitoba, because this is where this is going to be, the Valley View Bible Camp in McGregor, Manitoba, you can find out more at the website for the Bible Camp, valleyviewbiblecamp.com. That's valleyviewbiblecamp.com. In April, conference I can't officially announce yet, but it is coming to the Ozarks. Second weekend in April. Mark your calendar for that. We'll give you details as soon as we can. July 25th and 26th, the Go Therefore Conference. Sharon and I are confirmed for that event. This will be at the Harvest Revival Center in Brookville, Ohio. That's suburban Dayton, Ohio. GoThereforeConference.com. More details coming on that very soon. Another conference coming to the Ozarks that I can't tell you about just yet, but you can mark the dates, August 22nd through 24th. This will be in Springfield, Missouri, rather than Branson, as previous conferences have been. So looking forward to this. Springfield, Missouri, August 22nd through 24th, but no details yet. We'll give you those as soon as they are ready for release. And then another that we have just committed to that I'll tell you about as soon as I can in September 26th and 27th in Colorado, north of Denver. More details on that coming when I can release them. Our tour of Israel. I do need to tell you something very important about our tour of Israel. October 19th through 30th of this year, 2025. Sharon and I, we are committed. We are going. But due to conflicts with other events in October, our guests, Timothy Alberino, Doug Van Dorn, Dr. Judd Burton, have had to pull out. And we don't begrudge them this. We've had to reschedule this now 3 times because of the ongoing conflict there between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah. And so we are looking to dates in March or April of 2026, spring of 2026, for the Iron and Myth Tour with Doug, Judd, and Timothy. And we'll give you details on that as soon as we settle on dates. But our tour for this fall, October 19th through 30th, with an optional 3-day extension to Jordan, that is a go. You can find out the latest information. Just updated the website to include this at girls. Okay. Glory's getting in her licks, and Grace is telling her, I've had enough. Gilberthouse.org/travel, Gilberthouse.org/travel. travel. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to watch or listen, as the case may be. If you subscribe to the podcast through one of the various podcast websites, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Pandora, or wherever fine podcasts are sold, thank you. And please, if you get a spare moment, take a moment and give us a good review there. We sure appreciate that. Our announcer is the inimitable D.C. Good. And A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, except for those two. And good night, Oliver, wherever you are. I'm Derek Gilbert. This is A View from the Bunker.